Hello, everyone. This is number 10 in my ongoing series on YouTube that I've just called Jesus Archaeology. In this series, we're looking at textual evidence, primarily in the New Testament, but some texts outside, and archaeological or material evidence. Our goal is to get a better understanding of what we call the historical Jesus, what he actually was based on all of our evidence in his own time. Archaeology is a big part of that. I've spent a lot of time in the Holy Land doing archaeology, and in Jerusalem in particular, which we're going to talk about today. So we've come to the last week of Jesus' life. I'm calling this Final Days in Jerusalem. I'm going to go to the slides. So here we are, dateline Jerusalem, April 30 CE or AD, entering the lion's den. Here's this wonderful fisheye lens view of the old city of Jerusalem from Google Maps. I love this, the way you can still see the old city after 2,000 years. The basic structure, the walls have changed a bit. We're going to go down and take a look at it. But here is the Temple Mount. And we're going to be talking about this area right here where the ancient Jewish temple stood until the year 70. So this is 40 years before the temple was destroyed by the Romans. And this is the lion's den right here. And we're going to do a number of episodes. We're going to talk about a messianic temple takeover, stirring things in Herod's temple, a final evening meal, often called the Last Supper. What was that all about? Arrest in Gethsemane, quite a bit about that we're going to say. And then the trial. It has several stages to it, three basic stages as we put all the evidence together. And remember, we're doing the archaeology, where these things happened as well. What's been dug up? What's been exposed? Crucifixion and burial. How was crucifixion done in this time? What about burial? And then sightings of Jesus. How does that begin? So we're talking about, again, the final days of Jesus. And the overall question is, why was he killed? What were the forces that led to the slaying or murder of Jesus? And later, his brother James, and even later than that, his brother Simon. And this gets us all the way into the very early second century. So, what's going on with this family, the Jesus family? And before that, John the Baptizer, beheaded by Herod Antipas. Why all of this violence? What is the threat? We want to get into the political, the religious, the cultural, the social, and try to understand it all in the light of our material evidence. So it's going to be very exciting. Now, before I begin with the first segment on before I begin with the first segment on the temple takeover, I want to mention my book, The Jesus Dynasty, because this is essentially a narration of the kind of thing that I'm covering in this series of Jesus Archaeology. It has all of the textual material, lots of notes and illustrations and pictures and maps and diagrams and so forth. So if you get this book, you have a kind of printed version of the main things that I'm covering as an overview in this series on YouTube, Jesus Archaeology. You could say it's the textbook. Now, I want to start with where we left off last time. Jesus, remember, has headquartered himself at Capernaum. Just to review, if you haven't seen the previous episodes, you can go back and maybe watch them. I'll put the link in the description. He grew up in Nazareth, but remember, Cephas is very important. He sets up his headquarters here. But before he heads down to Jerusalem for Passover, which is that final week of his life, he goes all the way up to Caesarea Philippi. And you'll have to look at the previous episodes to see why he did that. And then he's going back down and he comes around and then he heads on down the Jordan Valley this way, as we're going to see. And here's another map. This is from Randy Ingerman's son, my friend. who check out his website here, ingermanson.com, has all these great maps and books. He writes historical fiction, highly recommended. We found that when Jesus went up to Caesarea Philippi, which is here, he's interested in Mount Hermon. So again, check the previous episodes, number 7, 8, and 9 before this one, and you'll get the whole story. And here's another map. As he heads down and he gets right to this area here, he crosses over the Jordan. Okay, I'm switching the map right here. And there is a wadi here where he spends the winter. So this would be probably December, January, February, March. And then he hears that his friend Lazarus in Jerusalem has died. Here's Jerusalem. And he begins to head down. But notice he goes across the Jordan River, which is the border of the territory of the Roman occupation of both Judea, Samaria, and Herod Antipas's territory in the north. So you see what he's doing. He's going along like this. He comes down to the spot where John the Baptist was baptizing years ago, crosses over to Jericho, and then on to Bethany and Jerusalem. He started to go through Samaria, which would be another way to avoid any kind of opposition. His cousin John has already been arrested and beheaded, and things are dangerous, and he's got the word that Herod Antipas is out to kill him. So he knows that. By the way, BibleMapper.com, another great website. You'll find maps like this. When he gets to Jerusalem, here's that Jericho road coming in. He headquarters himself in Bethany, and the Feast of Passover is a week away. And Bethany is the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, these two sisters and their brother Lazarus. And Lazarus has died. And the Gospel of John is the only one that covers this story about Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. But where we pick up the story is actually the first day when he goes down and confronts the lion's den, when he goes to the Temple Mount. And what he does, this road is still there today. I've taken it many times and walked it. He walks along the road and then heads up to the top, the summit of the Mount of Olives, just a little bit on the backside, the village of Bethphage. And then he heads down into the temple area. And I want to show you more details about that. So this is north, south, east, and west. You can see the outline of the city. And I want you to begin to get a feel for what it looks like by looking at archaeological maps and drawings, as well as what it looks like today after being partially excavated. This is a wonderful aerial view again of the old city. So there's that Temple Mount area. Today it's got the Dome of the Rock, which covers the area called Mount Moriah. Tradition says that Abraham took Isaac, his son, to this spot. Later, the Jewish temples were built here. And this is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Muslim mosque on the Temple Mount. But notice you can even see the walls of the city going around. And the walls on the east and here on the north and here on the west are pretty much the outline of the city in Jesus' time. But the more modern wall of the old city has been pulled up from the south under the rule of the Turks in the 16th century. In the time of Jesus, the city went all the way down like this and back around like that. So it was much bigger, as you're going to see on some of the maps. Here is an example. Here's that southern extension. Today, that southern wall just comes across like this at the edge of Herod's palace. But all of this was part of the city in the time of Jesus. And on the north, there wasn't much. So here's a drawing by my friend Balazs that I use in my Jesus Dynasty book. It has these illustrations. There's the Dead Sea. This is Jordan. Jericho would be over here, and Jesus came up the backside. This is the Mount of Olives from the backside, and Bethany is just over here. It's down the hill and then up a bit. As you're coming in from Bethany to Bethphage, this is the trail past Bethphage. It hasn't changed. And, you know, I've sat here in this area several times, taken students there, And, landscapes often stay the same. This is the Mount of Olives. We have olive trees, as you can see, and it's pretty rugged. And then it slopes on down right here. And so this is the way that Jesus and his entourage would have come in. And don't picture it like the movies with Jesus and 12 males walking around. He's got his mother and his sisters and all of his brothers, and the apostles or the 12 have their families. It's Passover. Everybody of the Jesus entourage is coming down from the Galilee, and they're following Jesus. They're the core messianic leadership group. At one point earlier, the previous year, he had sent out 70 of them, two by two. So we know there were that many. And you've got to add the women and the children and the campsites and the whole feeling of a kind of roving messianic entourage to get the feeling of the Jesus movement. This is a portable messianic movement with a provisional government, a council of 12 that Jesus has set up. And he's told the 12, you 12 are going to sit on 12 thrones, ruling the 12 tribes of Israel once the kingdom of God arrives. And he's expecting the breaking in of the kingdom of God. Now, here's a wonderful black and white image of the Mount of Olives. And so when you would come over from Bethphage and Bethany, you would come down this trail right here. Still today, this is how you would come. And this is the path that then leads down to the foot of the Mount of Olives. And if you go across here, the Kidron Valley would be right here. You're crossing right here. See, here's Bethany. And you can go then up into the temple, what I'm calling the lion's den. Let me go back a minute. Later, when Jesus is crucified, I'm going to present evidence and try to persuade you that the place where he's taken is up this path out of the Lion's Gate, which is over here on the north side of the city, and is crucified on the Mount of Olives, right at the summit, right here. And we'll talk about that. This area right here, which we'll get up close to and look at. It's bedrock right up here. You can see it. Now, so Jesus at this point gets a colt, remember, a donkey, and he rides down the trail. And we'll talk about that and what it meant. It's very important. It's a kind of pantomime, a messianic pantomime that basically says, O Zion, O Jerusalem, behold your king comes to you. And we'll read the passage as we go on down. So Jesus is self-consciously acting out a messianic role based upon his reading of the Hebrew prophets. Now, some scholars would say he never rode down the Mount of Olives. That was all put in later by the evangelists, say Mark, who first tells the story. But I think it's an accurate account of what most likely happened, is that Jesus is ready to confront the authorities. And by doing what he did, as I'll show you, and what follows the next day, he's basically driving his stake into the ground and saying, I am the Messiah, I am the one, and you're going to see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven, which is a power move according to the book of Daniel. And that comes from Daniel chapter 7, where the Son of Man receives power. And the Son of Man in that chapter stands for the people of God. He's expecting an overthrow of the powers that be. So here's a nice Oxford map. Notice this is the city in the time of Jesus, the red going down like that. This is later built and wasn't in existence in the time of Jesus. So there was this little jag going down. This is Herod's palace. Here's the Temple Mount. This is Mount Zion. It's a very wealthy area. And so where we're excavating on Mount Zion, and you can go to my YouTube channel and find all kinds of videos about that, is actually the center. Look, it's actually the center of the city of Jerusalem. This is kind of an extension, and it's right adjacent to the temple area. So what happens when Jesus crosses, enters the gate, and goes up these steps into the temple area? We're going to follow that as we go. Now, what Jesus is trying to do is to pantomime or picture or flash to the culture a week before Passover. Now it's called Palm Sunday, right? But that makes it kind of ecclesiastical and domesticated. No, this is a sort of revolutionary move because Zechariah 9:9 says, Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. That's a way of referring to Jerusalem. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Daughter means the people of. Lo, your king comes to you. When you say king, you're talking about a Davidic ruler. A Davidic ruler, a Messiah of the line of David, is going to come. He's triumphant and victorious, but he's humble, riding on an ass. So even though he has the potential of power and victory to set up the kingdom of God, he enters riding a beast of burden, a colt, the foal of an ass. But look what happens after that. I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim, those are the northern tribes, and the war horse from Jerusalem. In other words, there's not going to be any more war, and the battle bow shall be cut off. And he, that's the king, will command peace to the nations, and his dominion shall be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. And that is actually the Euphrates River. To the ends of the earth is the end of the land. So he's going to set up this messianic kingdom. So by riding in on the colt or the foal of the ass, what Jesus is signaling is the king has arrived. However, he believes that before the triumph comes is the humility and actually even the suffering. So he's following a scenario that we know also from the Dead Sea Scrolls, where the teacher of righteousness, the leader of the Dead Sea Scrolls, over 100 years before Jesus, had also pictured these events, and yet they didn't come in his own time. And now the followers of Jesus are sure. Remember, Jesus begins his teaching and preaching, and Jesus says the time is near, and repent and believe the gospel. So this is a end of the age messianic movement predicting God's overthrow of the powers of Rome and all the powers of the world and peace to the nations. Okay, what happens then? This is right after he comes down riding on the donkey. Mark 11:11. He enters Jerusalem, and I'll show you where he entered, we're pretty sure, and went into the temple. And when he looked around at everything, it's late in the day. And then he goes out to Bethany back over the mountain with the 12, you see? So he's got his entourage with him. He takes the 12 as his leaders. Doesn't mean nobody else is there, because when he rides down the mountain, you've got the crowds gathering and he's very popular. He's just mobbed, actually, as you're going to see. Now, the next day, he leaves Bethany again. So he's got this MO every morning, day after day, stay overnight in Bethany with his entourage, and then get up the next morning and walk over the summit of the Mount of Olives down that path that we saw. So next morning from Bethany, notice they came to Jerusalem, and he enters the temple and began to drive out those who sold and who bought in the temple. Now that's a prophecy from Zechariah that when the kingdom of God comes, when God becomes king over all the earth, Zechariah 14, there will be no traders, Traders, in the house of the Lord. So again, he's symbolically shutting down the trade. He overturns the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. I'll get back to the money changers as we go. And notice this, a lot of people miss this. This is Mark. Mark's our earliest account of this. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. Now, when we get to the diagrams and the maps, you're going to see this makes sense. It's actually pretty easy to block. And he taught and said to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it a den of robbers? That translation I'm going to question, and it might be the key to understanding this whole incident. But notice this, and the chief priests and the scribes heard it. These are the enemies of Jesus, the Sadducean priests primarily, the gang of Annas, who's the godfather of a priestly clan. He has 5 sons that are high priests. His son-in-law Caiaphas is high priest and is involved in the arrest of Jesus. But look, they heard this and they sought a way to destroy him. And I'm going to present to you the idea based on this verse here, that what really led to the arrest and trial and crucifixion of Jesus, even though the Romans were willing to go along with it because of the threat of sedition, Still, it's because the temple is being threatened. That's the key. They want to destroy him, for they feared him because of the multitude and were astonished at his teaching. So we're going to get a week of that teaching. I'll do a whole episode on it. And notice, and when evening came, they went out of the city. So they're there all day, and the temple is essentially shut down. And so I call this Jesus and the temple shutdown. People don't usually call it that, but I think this blocking of the entrances and exits where people can't go in and out. Now, here's a modern shot, a nice aerial shot of the southern area. This is the Temple Mount. There's the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is just the southern and eastern corner of it. And these excavations we're going to examine very carefully because today you can actually go up these steps. They've been excavated, and then you hit a solid wall, which is the Turkish wall, but you can see remnants of the wall. It has not moved. This corner has not moved. So the temple was right up here. But anyway, so Jesus would have come down the Mount of Olives, down the path, crossed over, and there would be a gate here, and he would have gone on up into the temple. And we're going to see a lot more as we go. Now, here's another view. This is the south. This is now the west. This is the north, and that's the Mount of Olives on the east. There's a court of the Gentiles, and then Israelites could go past a certain barrier that was right here and right here. And then you could go actually into the compound itself. There's a place for women and a place for men and a place for sacrifice. And then you've got the temple. And this is the upper city, and this is Herod's palace. And so we can locate all of these things, and the excavations that we've been doing are actually right here, just on the edge of the photo. And we'll see more of that as we go along. Here's another view that gives you a better angle of those steps. There's the triple gates. There's some steps that you can't see there. And here's the double gates. So this was blocked up. The crowds come up the pilgrim's path, which is now uncovered. When I take tours to Jerusalem in the future, we'll actually walk underground on this pilgrim's path. I'll talk about that later at another time. And Jesus goes up these steps and essentially will not allow commerce to come in or out. It says he won't allow things to go in or out. And here under this pavilion, which is part of Solomon's portico that goes all the way around, this is where people could gather and meet and sit in the shade and so forth. And we think this is where the commerce went on. It's very beautiful inside. Later, we're going to explore it more. Here's another way to go in. And here's another way. So there are other gates around. Whether everything was blocked or more, just this area probably where the money changers are, because that's where people are coming, walking up and bringing things in and out for the sacrifices as we get up to Passover. Now today, when Jews pray, this is the existing prayer wall you see in the time of Jesus. In other words, this is an excavated area around like this. And notice this archway going up this entrance called Robinson's Arch today. When this was first excavated in the 60s, the 1960s, the soil was all the way up here, and I'll show you a picture. You can actually see, I remember in 1962, I went here and I stood right here and put my hand on here. I could reach it. I wasn't way down here. So when people are praying today at the Western Wall, they're right here in this little segment. So actually the Western Wall is not the temple, it's the pavilion around the temple that Herod built. And it actually would be this whole western side, could be the Western Wall. And in fact, some Jews have established a little wall up to the north here, round about there. So this gives you kind of an idea. This is Rittmeyer's drawing, I think, lean for all of his wonderful artwork. And here's another breakdown of it where you get more of the idea. So here's the double gate, here's the triple gate. They're called the Hulda gates. I'm going to show you a video in this series of Final Days of Jesus, and you'll be able to picture all this in 3D and even walk inside. And you would come up here from inside the portico area here, and then you could go into the areas. This is the courts of the Gentiles. This is the courts of the Israelites. And this is the temple itself. The Romans have a fortress here. They can watch over the temple area just to keep everything under control because this is revolutionary. Now, in a future episode, I'm going to talk totally about the temple. How big was it? All the riches of it, some of the things that have been excavated. But today we want to stick with Jesus coming up the steps and going into the temple. Now, here's what it looked like when I first went in the 1960s. All of this was soil, and you couldn't see the steps or anything. And right around this corner is that arch where you could just stand and literally put your hand on it. And I was in the old city walking all around. This is, of course, the Mount of Olives, but notice it's not very populated. Today, this whole top of the Mount of Olives is just crowded with residential areas. But in the 60s, it was pretty bare. And here's that Western Wall where Jews pray. Here's where I stood in the 60s, right here. All this soil's been removed. All of this has been removed. And by the way, this has been excavated with attention and care to all the cultures. Like a lot of these structures are Islamic. They were not torn down, they were left. And finally, the steps going up here are preserved so that you can get an idea of what it'd be like. And you can see where the doors were, even though this is the Turkish wall. So it's just extraordinary to go even today to what we call the Temple Mount because it's still like a huge box that Herod the Great built. And there are Herodian stones, foundation stones all the way around, still in existence from the first century. Here are those steps up close. And you can see this is actually part of one of the gates. And then you can see right here, I don't know, it's very faint, but you can see where the gates go like this. And of course, they're all blocked up. But look right here. These stones are the original stones from the time of Jesus. These have been covered over where people won't wear them down more. But look, you can walk on some of the original bedrock steps. So they're cut out of bedrock. This goes all the way back. And when Jesus, or anyone from the first century for that matter, was entering into the temple from the south, they would actually walk up these steps. Now, what about this money changing? What I heard all my life growing up in Sunday school and so forth is that the money had to be changed because it was pagan money, it was Gentile money, meaning people were coming from all over the Roman Empire and even beyond, and they were coming up to Passover, the Jewish people from all these lands, and they would bring their own coinage, and it all needs to be changed into good, holy Jewish coins. Sounds right. Actually, that's not the case. We now know that the priest demanded that no matter what coin you brought, it had to be converted to Tyrrhenian shekels. Why? Because they're 99.99% pure silver, and they want the donations to the temple to be the purest of silver. When you bring coins from what, Cyrene or wherever on the African coast, or you bring coins from Greece or Rome or even Spain or Britain, it's all part of the Roman Empire. Uh, who knows the quality of those coins? They have to be evaluated. So you got this commerce going on. But look, on the back of the coin are certainly pagan images, and on the front, human images, which is not allowed on Jewish coins. And you can imagine the prices and what the exchange rate must have been. Sort of like what we call today airport prices, where you just pay 5 times what you would normally pay for something. But you had to get the Tyrrhenian shekel made in Tyre up to the north because of its purity. And then what about the animals? This is where they're sacrificed right here. Here's the altar. This is inside the temple. This is part of the 3D video that I'm going to show you. It would actually be at Passover, just completely crowded with hundreds and hundreds of animals. And it would be like a kind of a slaughterhouse with lots of bloodshed and the Passover lambs being slaughtered. This is all described by Josephus, the contemporary historian, and the thousands of animals that were slain during this Passover time. We had read earlier in Mark 11 this quote that my house, which is supposed to be a house of prayer, has become a den of thieves. Remember, I said I wanted to come back to this because Jesus is quoting Jeremiah, but we have it in Greek. And if you look at Jeremiah 7:11, has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers? That's the translation. This is the word cave, me'ara, but paritzim means shredders. This is actually a layer of ravenous animals that shred the animals. So, in other words, it's supposed to be a house of prayer. Instead, it's a place of shredding animals, just like a ravenous beast. In fact, the word right here, parats, to break open, rip apart, burst forth, or shred, or let's just say slaughter, is used in Isaiah 35, verse 9, for a ravenous beast along a pathway that would jump you and rip you apart. So, literally, a layer of rippers, a layer of shredders. And even in Greek, a word is used, lestes, often translated brigand or robber, but it also means a violent person who's going to jump you and stab you and rip you open and break you open and take your goods. In other words, it is violence. House of prayer versus a place of violence and of bloodshed. Now, you say, well, it was Passover. They're commanded to do that. But they're not commanded to kill the Passover lambs in the temple. This could be the objection of Jesus. Jeremiah, let's go back to Jeremiah, same chapter. 40 years before the destruction of the first temple, Jeremiah went into that temple and said much the same. Add to your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, eat the flesh. This is sarcasm, like, go on, shred the animals, eat, eat, eat. For in the day that I brought you out of Egypt, I did not speak to your fathers or command them concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. So here is a polemic against the sacrificial cult of the temple, that it is not the ideal religion by none other than Jeremiah the prophet. Well, what happened to him? He was arrested, thrown in a pit, and almost killed. And what happens to Jesus? He's threatening an entire religious practice here of Judaism worldwide as a whole at Passover. And notice, what is it that God wants? This is the command: obey my voice, and I'll be your God, and you'll be my people. And this is the way that I command you. So Jeremiah also says, you shed innocent blood in this place, if you read the whole chapter. And he's very sarcastic in this chapter. And if you read it in Hebrew, it's like, can you believe this is supposed to be for prayer? And it's like a layer of ravenous animals ripping up corpses. You see the idea? That's the original meaning of the den of robbers. Den of robbers gives the idea of like dividing up the loot. That's not the original meaning. And we know that because the later Jewish followers of Jesus, they were called Ebionites. I'm not talking about the Pauline wing of the movement. Epiphanius, who hates them, records that they have a saying of Jesus: I have come to abolish sacrifices, and if you do not stop sacrificing, the wrath will not cease from you. It is written, I desire loving kindness, not sacrifice, quoting Hosea 6:6. Now, you're going to find this in the book of Amos as well, where Amos says, did I command you concerning offerings and sacrifices? And the answer is, I never wanted this, and lots of passages in the prophets. Now, those who support sacrifice would say, oh, well, what was wrong is they were insincere in the way they were doing it. The way it's presented here is a house of prayer that would be quiet and meditative versus a place of incredible bloodshed and violence. Can you imagine the thousands and thousands of animals, all of the blood, all of the entrails, all the violence, even the noise, the smells, the sounds? It's just soundly condemned by Jesus. So I wanted you to get two main things out of this video. I wanted you to get a feel for the place, the Mount of Olives, walking up, Bethany, Bethphage, coming down the path, what it would be like to enter up those steps from the south, how they've been excavated. And next time, much more about what's going on inside the temple. So that was number one. But number two, what really gets Jesus in trouble? In the Gospel of Mark, he kind of lays low because he doesn't want to get arrested. John the Baptist is already dead at this point. And this is what happens to messiahs. Josephus, the contemporary Jewish historian of the time, he's later than Jesus, but he looks back and he mentions a dozen messiahs, including Jesus, and every one of them gets wiped out basically. But Jesus here is actually coming to Jerusalem, the capital. Some of these others are maneuvering, Judas the Galilean and Simon of Perea and so forth. They do various things at various points. But Jesus confronts the temple authorities head on, and he, like Jeremiah, 40 years before the destruction of the second temple, notice 30 to 70, and Jeremiah, 40 years before the destruction of the first temple, said in effect, this temple, this house, which you call by my name, has become a lair of shredding, ravenous beasts. Take it away, so to speak. And then Jesus begins to talk about how the temple is going to be destroyed later at the end of that week. And we'll get to that as well. So take care, everybody. I hope you've learned some interesting things from this very first part, number 10. And we're going to go ahead through our different episodes and stages of that week as we lead to the final moments when Jesus is finally killed.